Chris, we know that the church is meant to be a called out people, to be a countercultural people, to no matter the era, we are to look different than the world around us. The church isn't the only community in society, of course. There are plenty of people that are involved in all sorts of communities, built around all sorts of different aspirations and aims and hobbies and interests. What is it specifically about the church that would mark us out from other kinds of communities that exist in our society?
That's an incredibly important question, isn't it? I guess that the New Testament gives us a pretty clear steer on that. We can't make up an answer to that. We given the answer to that. So there's the John 13 principle. By this will all people know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Pretty clear. That's going to be a distinctive, the way that we relate to each other in love. I think, John 17, Jesus' high priestly prayer, he prays that his followers may be one, that the world may know that you sent me. I think our unity should be a distinctive, and we often have to hang our heads in shame, don't we, that isn't a Christian distinctive, but it should be, and Jesus prays that it would be. And I think that as we show those, we will also distinguish ourselves from other communities in society by being neither of the two things that everybody is sort of sucked towards these days. So society is sort of resolving itself, I think, into either state organizations, political organizations, or corporate organizations. And everything that's not either political or corporate feels the pull of those two right. sort of suns around which our planet, our culture orbits. And so, churches feel the need to sort of reinvent themselves as political organizations, as activist organizations or campaigning organizations. And churches, feel a pull to take on ideas and the ethos of the business world and to reinvent themselves as companies. And I think increasingly, one way that we can show the love and the unity that Jesus commands us to have as New Testament believers is to resist both of those pulls and to say, no, we're not a political organization first and foremost. We're not an arm of government. We're not an activist campaigning organization. And we're not for profit, and we're not going to remake ourselves in the image of a for-profit organization either. We're something different and distinctive that often looks flabby and inefficient to a mindset that sees everything either as an arm of government or as part of the corporate sector. But that's what we are, and that's what we need to seek to remain in being faithful to Christ.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of conversation in recent years about the loss of mediating institutions, the institutions that are not the state, and neither are they just the individual family unit, and the church being, in some sense, something that it's good for the culture when there is a buffer, when there is something that's not all politics all the time, or not all business, but is actually there for something else. But it is difficult to resist the pull in those two areas, around those two suns, in part because we want to be good stewards of resources. So we want to eliminate certain inefficiencies that we might be able to at some level, even though that's not the logic that should be driving us. And at the same time, there is activism is one of the evangelical impulses. One of the four major characteristics of evangelicals. We've always had something of a political presence. So how can we, adopt some of what we see as good in this world and in the other without necessarily being, like you said, just sucked into losing our ability to stand out?
Yeah, I think perhaps the question that we need to ask ourselves, or perhaps that we need to ask others about ourselves, because we're often the very worst judge of ourselves, aren't we? And it's our own blind spots that we don't see. And we think, I'm not in any danger of being sucked in by, this sort of state mentality or the corporate mentality, and everybody around us, yes, you are. You watch out. So perhaps the question we need to ask other people is are these things filling our horizon as Christians? Are they the language and the logic that we speak and that we pray in and that we use in sort of, church board meetings or however churches are organised. Because as you say, it's not that Christians should completely shun anything that's ever been anywhere near a management book and, heaven forfend, or that we should, never seek to work for the peace and prosperity of society in ways that are, political. Not at all. But I think it's when those fill our horizon, when those become the motivating force and the reason for the existence of the community, or the thing that the community spends its time thinking about when it meets together, then the alarm bell should be going off.
There is another kind of community that we should stand out from that I would just throw out there, and I wonder if you agree with this, but there are communities today that are neither corporate communities or the state that are gathering around particular interests that are all for the realization of individual self-fulfillment or actualization, whether it be communities around working out or around certain kinds of diet programs or exercise programs or certain kinds of almost quasi-pseudo-religious type communities. And I just wonder if a lot of people see the church as just another one of those, to help you, I guess, be the best kind of person you can be morally, or to achieve your, an inner peace that you're looking for. And of course, the church should form us morally, and the church should give us peace and rest. And there are aspects that I would say, yes, that is an important aspect of what the church does offer. But almost coming at it again from an individualistic standpoint, where it's all about my expressing myself, my finding myself, and the church just helps me to do that. And so that's why I am there. How does a church recognize that is one of the needs that might bring people into a congregation, but also move people beyond that as being the filling of the horizon, as you say?
Yeah, I think this is an Ephesians 3 question. Because you're right, the church isn't just another interest group, but there's a sense in which it is a very particular sort of interest group. It's just that the interest isn't ours. It is the community that gathers for God's interests.
That's right.
And to glorify Him. So it's not that it's devoid of all interest, but the thing that is amazing about Ephesians 3, isn't it? That Paul has gone, Ephesians 1, Ephesians 2, these huge, overarching theological sort of eulogies of how God, before the creation of the world, chose us and how we're saved by grace. And then it sort of narrows down in Ephesians 3. And he's saying to the church, you should basically get on with one another so that the powers and authorities in the heavenly realms know that God is wise. And you sort of reading your Bible and you think, how does that work? And I think what he's saying is that church communities are not gathered around a common interest and not gathered just because I like being with these people. In fact, there might be people in this community that I profoundly do not like being around. But it's precisely because I love those people that the powers and authorities in the heavenly realms go, wow, God is doing something amazing here. So I think that's the difference. Like if I'm a part of the local squash club and I don't like the people there, then I go and find another one.
That's right.
But if I'm part of a church and there are people who are just not like me, I don't have a lot in common with them, then I rejoice and I stay there, because that is how God demonstrates His wisdom in the last days. And so there's a very different dynamic to why we gathered and what we do when that gathering is awkward as well.
And the irony is, because of that difference in that difference in logic and that difference of even understanding why we're there, the irony is, though, that is how God actually does form us and make us the person that He wants us to be. So He is forming us individually through sometimes being in community with those that are challenging sometimes to be with.
That's a really profound comment. I mean, you don't grow a lot if you're always around people just like you, do you? I think that's one thing that marriage, but not only marriage, all close relationships teach you. You find that when you're sort of rubbing up against each other, that's when you're going to grow. That's when you're going to learn things about yourself that you find uncomfortable, but that it's incredibly important to learn. And, if I was always with people who simply reflected me back to myself, I'd never find that. And so there's a deep and yet awkward blessing in church communities.
And that's one of the things that makes it countercultural.
Yeah.